The 3 a.m. medication count never lies. Megan O'Brien's hands moved through the locked cabinet with the speed of muscle memory, each vial catalogued, each number recorded in her leather pocket notebook, the one she kept hidden beneath the extra gauze in her locker, the one she'd been filling for 6 months with small observations that didn't add up. Morphine sulfate. Fentanyl patches. Hydromorphone. The reorder quantities Dr. Pierce had approved last month showed a 15% inflation across the board, discrepancies that wandered through the digital system like ghosts nobody was supposed to notice. But Megan noticed everything. She'd been trained to notice everything, to track resources under fire, to count ammunition, to know exactly what you had and what you didn't before the shooting started. The Seattle General ICU in Denver hummed with the white noise of ventilators and cardiac monitors, a rhythm that had become her only language since the Army erased her service record 5 years ago and ordered her to vanish into civilian life. Nobody asked questions about nurses. Nobody looked twice at the woman in blue scrubs who folded supply linens with obsessive precision or changed 4 bags with movements that belonged to someone who'd done critical medical procedures in sandstorms under gunfire. She pressed her thumb against the scar on her forearm, thin, silvered tissue that ran parallel to her ulna in a pattern that matched IED blast fragmentation, and felt the familiar numbness where sensation had never quite returned. The scars on both forearms were mirror images, symmetrical in the way only shrapnel injuries could be, the kind of wounds that came from holding a bleeding soldier while rounds snapped overhead. Those scars had a story. She had no story to tell. Captain Megan O'Brien was legally dead. The Defense Intelligence Agency had made that clear during the debrief in a windowless room at Bagram Airfield, voices speaking in soft administrative tones about classified operations and national security liabilities and the necessity of permanent erasure. Her service record had been scrubbed. Her photograph removed from unit rosters. Her name removed from casualty reports, commendation lists, everything that proved she'd ever existed beyond the rank of captain and the call sign they'd used in Ramadi, Valkyrie, a name that only 300 people in the world were still alive to remember, and most of them were either dead or deep enough in classified work that they'd never speak it aloud again. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, a sound like electricity caught in amber, and Megan logged the final count without looking up. The medication cabinet locked with a soft click. Her shift report went into the digital system at exactly 3:17 a.m., right on schedule, right on time, just like every shift for the past 18 months. Nobody questioned Megan O'Brien's documentation. Her numbers were always precise. Her counts were always accurate. She was the kind of nurse that hospitals needed, reliable, unobtrusive, invisible, and that invisibility had become the only safe place left to hide. Bed 12 held a young man with sergeant's tattoos on his inner wrist and a tracheostomy scar that ran like a thin line of violence across the front of his neck. Corporal Roy Arden, 28 years old. Admitted 4 days ago with complications from his injury, his vocal cord severed by shrapnel during a patrol outside Sanjin Valley, a firefight where a Taliban IED had detonated under his Humvee and left him alive but permanently unable to speak above a whisper, if he could speak at all. The medical record said he was a Special Forces medic. It didn't say much else, because classified soldiers rarely came to civilian hospitals with complete paperwork. Megan had pieced it together from his tattoos and his bearing and the way his eyes tracked the room with tactical precision even from a sedated hospital bed. He was still scanning for exits. Still mapping the room. Still thinking in combat terms even though the only threat here was pain and the slow work of healing and the knowledge that his war was probably over in ways that had nothing to do with recovery. She changed his for at 3:44 a.m., moving with economical precision around the monitors and the oxygen line and the drainage bag that hung beneath his bed. Her fingers found the port in the line, checked the infusion rate, adjusted the drip with the kind of confidence that came from having performed medical procedures on soldiers bleeding out in the dust. Her movements were military, spare, efficient, no wasted motion, and as she reset the timer on the pump, her fingers paused half a second on the unit designation, the way someone pauses when they recognize something. A 75th Ranger medic. She'd served with Rangers. She'd trained with Rangers. She'd bled with Rangers. The tracheostomy scar caught the overhead light, and she saw in it a story similar to her own, a body that had survived, a voice that hadn't, a life that had transformed into something unrecognizable. Riordan's eyes opened slightly as she worked. His gaze tracked her face, searching for something, recognition maybe, or connection, or proof that someone understood the particular loneliness of being alive when parts of you should have died with the rest of your unit. He lifted his right hand slowly from the bed. His fingers formed letters with the precision of sign language. FOB, Forward Operating Base. He was asking her. Asking if she knew. Asking where she'd been. Asking the question he couldn't voice. Megan's jaw tightened once, a movement barely perceptible to anyone watching, and then released. She pressed her fingertips against the saline bag and held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before she looked away and checked the cardiac monitor. Her voice, when she spoke, came out soft and professional and completely neutral. Your heart rate's elevated. You need to rest. She wasn't saying yes. She wasn't saying no. She was saying what was true. His heart was elevated. He did need rest. And somewhere in those clinical observations, she was telling him something else, that she understood, that she wouldn't ask, that they could exist in this hospital room together in the kind of silence that only soldiers shared. She finished his vital signs and made the notations in his chart and left the room without looking back. That was the code. That was how you survived when your own existence was officially fictional. You didn't make connections. You didn't acknowledge shared history. You moved through the world as a series of clinical observations and documented care procedures and anonymous hands belonging to an invisible woman in blue scrubs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part walked through the ICU doors at 4:15 a.m. in Italian leather shoes that clicked against the linoleum like a countdown timer. Dr. Marcus Pierce. Expensive watch. Expensive shirt beneath his white coat, the kind of shirt that cost more than Megan's monthly rent. He carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who'd never experienced consequences, never had his authority questioned, never been forced to consider the possibility that the world didn't exist to accommodate his wants. His eyes moved across the ICU with the focused intensity of a predator assessing its territory, checking on investments, confirming that everything remained exactly as it should be. And then his gaze locked on Megan. She was logging medication updates at the nurse's station, her face blank, her movements deliberate and unhurried, the perfect picture of a competent nurse doing the work she was paid to do. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply existed in the space she occupied, taking up no room, making no impression, asking for nothing. But something in the way Dr. Pierce watched her shifted. His jaw tightened. His shoulders squared. His hand rose to adjust his already perfect collar, a small tell, barely visible, the kind of unconscious gesture that happened when someone's carefully ordered world encountered a variable that didn't fit the equation. He moved toward the medication cabinet. Megan heard his shoes approaching, heard the soft rustle of his coat, heard the breath he drew in before he spoke. Nurse O'Brien. His voice carried the precise diction of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'd like to review your recent medication audits. Megan finished the entry she was logging and only then looked up. Her eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, flat and calm and utterly unreadable. They're in the system, Doctor. All counts verified against administration. She paused. Every discrepancy documented. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Dr. Pierce's face didn't change. His expression remained composed, professional, completely appropriate. But his hand moved to his wrist and his thumb pressed against his pulse point, once, twice, 3 times, the way someone checked their own vital signs when they suddenly felt their heart rate accelerate. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course they are, he said quietly. You strike me as someone who's very thorough. He walked away. His shoes clicked across the linoleum and disappeared down the hallway toward his office, and the ICU returned to its baseline rhythm of ventilators and monitors and the fluorescent hum that sounded like electricity caught in amber. Megan returned to her documentation. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing remained even. The only sign of what had just happened was the way she touched the small folded flag in her left scrub pocket, the one she'd carried for 6 years, the one that had belonged to her teammate, the one who hadn't made it out of Ramadi. She didn't know it yet, but she had just identified herself to a man who couldn't afford witnesses. She had just made herself a problem that Dr. Pierce would now spend every available moment figuring out how to eliminate. The pharmaceutical kickback scheme he'd been running through Seattle General, inflating morphine orders, splitting the difference with suppliers, clearing $50,000 a month in cash that moved through offshore accounts and shell corporations, that scheme required staff who didn't ask questions. It required compliant nurses. It required people who looked the other way. It did not require Captain Megan O'Brien. It did not require someone with the kind of mathematical precision that came from counting ammunition. It did not require a woman who noticed things. And Dr. Pierce was someone who solved his problems quickly. Morning rounds began like every other morning at Seattle General, 12 staff members orbiting Dr. Pierce as he moved through the ICU, his white coat pristine, his voice pitched to educate and intimidate simultaneously. The ventilator in bed 9 wheezed its mechanical rhythm while he stood at the foot of bed 7, suddenly stopping the procession with the precision of a conductor silencing an orchestra. "Let's discuss what not to do in patient care," he said, his eyes finding Megan across the cluster of residents and med students. "Nurse O'Brien, step forward." She moved from her position near the medication cart, her pace steady, her expression the same neutral mask she'd worn since 0600 hours. 23 years of military discipline made civilian protocol feel like speaking a foreign language she'd already mastered. "Notice the overfamiliar body language with the patient in bed 12, Dr. Pierce continued, gesturing without looking back at the mute corporal whose dark eyes tracked every interaction in the room. "We're medical professionals, not grief counselors. The boundaries between caregiver and patient exist for psychological reasons. Perhaps they didn't cover that extensively in your nursing program, Nurse O'Brien." 2 residents smirked. A med student looked away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in their plastic casings. Megan felt the weight of 12 gazes, some pitying, some contemptuous, all of them cataloguing her response like she was a teaching moment, a cautionary tale about what happened when nurses forgot their place. Her hands remained at her sides. Steady. The right thumb pressed hard against her index finger, a compression so slight that only someone trained to read body language under interrogation would notice it. This was restraint. This was the trembling that never became a tremor, the anger that never reached her voice. "Yes, doctor," she said, tone flat as a cardiac flatline. No apology. No explanation. Just acknowledgement of his authority and the implicit understanding that she would accept his framing without resistance. The rounds continued. Dr. Pierce moved to the next bed, discussing electrolyte management with a first-year resident who hung on every word. Megan returned to the medication cart, her movements precise and mechanical, the kind of functionality that comes from turning off everything except the job. By 0800 hours, she had documented fluid intake and output for 4 patients, changed 2 central line dressings, and drawn blood cultures from a septic patient, all while the sting of his words burned somewhere she didn't allow herself to feel it. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1145 hours, near the vending machines by the main corridor, Megan was refilling her water bottle at the dispenser when Dr. Pierce's voice drifted across the break area like smoke. He stood with 2 residents, gesturing at his phone, speaking loud enough for the gathering lunch crowd to hear every syllable. "You know what I've noticed? Nursing school standards have really dropped over the past decade," he said, his tone conversational, almost regretful. "Used to be you could count on basic competence. Critical thinking. Awareness of appropriate professional boundaries." He paused, letting the word settle. "Now? Sometimes I wonder if they're training nurses or just hiring warm bodies with a pulse." The 2 residents beside him exchanged glances, then looked at Megan. One of them smiled, not the kind smile of a colleague, but the smile of someone who'd just been given permission to laugh at someone beneath them. She didn't stop filling her water bottle. Her spine remained straight, her posture the same upright bearing she'd maintained in convoy vehicles moving through Ramadi streets, where hesitation was a bullet in the back. Her peripheral vision catalogued every face that laughed, every subtle adjustment of body language that signaled alliance with Dr. Pierce's assessment. These were the residents who'd complimented her work 2 weeks ago. These were the med students who'd asked her questions about proper for placement. People were like that, they shifted allegiances the moment a superior officer suggested a new direction. She capped her water bottle, turned, and walked past them without a glance. That afternoon, the real threat arrived. Dr. Pierce intercepted her near the nurse's station, his presence suddenly material, his voice a whisper that cut through the ambient sound of beeping monitors and keyboard clicks. "Nurse O'Brien, a moment." She turned. His smile was calculated, the kind of expression that conveyed absolute certainty of his power over her immediate future. "Security escorts for terminated employees are standard protocol now," he said, his hands clasped in front of him like a man discussing the weather. "Just so you're aware of hospital policy. It's a liability issue, you understand. We have to make sure departing staff don't access patient records or medications after their separation is finalized." He tilted his head slightly. "Never know when we'll need to implement it. Could be tomorrow. Could be next week. Hospital administration is very concerned about compliance these days." The message beneath the message was clear, he was building the structure for her removal. He'd already begun erecting the justifications, creating the paper trail. The public humiliation during rounds wasn't random, it was documentation. The disparaging remarks near the vending machines weren't casual, they were witnesses. And now this conversation was a personal threat, delivered with enough plausible deniability that she couldn't report it without sounding paranoid. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Not longer, that would be confrontational. Not shorter, that would be submissive. Military bearing disguised as civilian deference. "Understood, doctor," she said, her voice carrying the same flat tone as before. He nodded, satisfied, and walked away. Megan returned to her charting, her hands moving through the motions of documentation, blood pressure readings, medication administration times, patient assessments logged into the system with the precision of someone recording evidence. Her heart rate had elevated perhaps 10 beats per minute. Her respiration remained controlled. These were physical facts she catalogued like data points on a monitor screen. But that wasn't the worst part either. By 19:30 hours, when the day shift had transitioned to night shift and the ICU had settled into its evening rhythm, Megan found herself alone in the supply closet on the 2nd floor, a narrow room lined with shelves of sterile gauze, for bags, catheter kits, and the 1,000 consumable materials that kept a hospital functioning. She'd volunteered for the inventory recount, and now she stood organizing 4 bags by size and expiration date with mechanical precision, each movement a small ritual of order imposed on chaos. Her hands moved down the shelf. 500 milliliters normal saline behind 1 liter bags. Lactated ringers sorted by batch number. The fluorescent light above her head cast everything in a clinical white glow that made the room feel sterile and empty. From her right scrub pocket, she pulled out the folded flag. 3 inches by 3 inches, made from the ceremonial flag that had draped her teammate's casket 6 years ago. She'd cut a small triangle from the corner after the funeral while standing in a bathroom stall at Arlington National Cemetery, her jaw clenched so hard her teeth had ached for 3 days afterward. The rest of the flag had been returned to his family. This fragment, this small piece of stars and stripes worn thin by 6 years of being carried in a pocket, had become the only physical reminder that Captain Megan O'Brien had ever existed outside the erased records and classified operations that the Defense Intelligence Agency had scrubbed from every official database. Her thumb traced the worn stars. The supply closet was 12 feet by 8 feet, concrete walls, industrial shelving, and the faint smell of antiseptic and cardboard. It was the closest thing to privacy she'd found in the 2 weeks since she'd arrived at Seattle General. She allowed her breathing to adjust, deeper now, more deliberate. Her eyes closed. She wasn't trembling. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the compression of 6 years of buried combat experience into a civilian identity that had no explanation for why she could make life-or-death decisions in 60 seconds, or how she knew which patients would code in the next 4 hours just by looking at their pupils and skin color, or why she'd nearly approached the hospital administrator's office yesterday but had stopped herself at the threshold. Because Captain Megan O'Brien officially died in Ramadi. The Defense Intelligence Agency had made that clear when they buried her service records after the operation that was never supposed to exist, a joint task force extraction of a compromised asset from Fallujah, involving 3 squads and a target acquisition that had gone sideways in ways that couldn't be explained in official channels. The agency's position was categorical: if she surfaced, if anyone investigated her background, if her name appeared in any official capacity, the entire identity she'd constructed would collapse. She would be a liability. A security breach. A ghost trying to exist in daylight. So she couldn't report what she'd found in the pharmaceutical records. She couldn't escalate her concerns about Dr. Pierce's morphine orders to the hospital administrator. She couldn't do anything except remain invisible, maintain her mask, and accept whatever came next with the same composure that had kept her alive in convoy vehicles and field hospitals and night operations that had no names. Her hand folded the flag back into its precise square and returned it to her pocket. Then she heard it, boots on tile in the corridor outside. Measured pace. Military cadence. She opened the supply closet door just in time to see Corporal James Riordan moving through the hallway on his morning ambulation circuit, his tall frame moving with the kind of careful deliberation that came from relearning how to exist in civilian space. His chart listed him as medically discharged after a convoy ambush in Sanjan Valley. The unit designation was 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. Not her unit. The unit that had replaced her unit. The unit that had sent new medics to do the work Captain Megan O'Brien used to do. He'd taken her place and lost his voice for it. Their eyes met for less than a second as he passed the supply closet. His dark eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, survived things that shouldn't be survivable, and was now living in a hospital as a patient instead of a warrior. He didn't acknowledge her. She didn't acknowledge him. But in that fraction of a moment, something passed between them: recognition. The absolute certainty that whoever they both had been before, that version of themselves had died in a place most people couldn't find on a map. He continued his ambulation. She returned to organizing 4 bags. The night stretched ahead, 12 more hours of charting and medication administration and the careful maintenance of a civilian identity that was beginning to feel less like a disguise and more like a tomb. By morning, Dr. Pierce would have made more phone calls. By next week, the documentation would be complete. By month's end, she'd be escorted out of Seattle General by security, her brief attempt at civilian life concluded, her invisible service to this hospital recognized by no one except the one patient who understood that she wasn't just a nurse. She was someone who had survived Ramadi. And he was someone who was supposed to. The monitor at bed 12 screamed at 2:13 a.m. One long continuous wail that cut through the fluorescent-lit silence like a combat alarm. Megan's head snapped up from the medication cart where she'd been entering 4 counts with the same methodical precision she'd used to inventory supplies in forward operating base Ramadi. The rhythm on the screen was gone. Replaced by what looked like a flat line with spikes, chaotic, wrong, terrifying to most people. Corporal Riordan's chest was rigid. Completely immobile. His lips had turned from pink to a bluish purple in the time it took Megan to cross the 12 feet from the nurse's station to his bedside. His eyes were wide. Panicked. Silent, of course. Shrapnel had stolen his voice 3 years ago, but it hadn't stolen his ability to convey terror. Pressures dropping, Megan said into the call button, keeping her voice level, conversational. Bed 12 is decompensating. I need the on-call resident. Now. The attending was 40 minutes away. Everyone knew this at 2:24 a.m. on a Wednesday. The hospital operated on skeleton crew after midnight, and Dr. Pierce had made sure she knew exactly how replaceable she was supposed to be. The resident appeared 4 minutes later, Dr. Marcus Webb, a 3rd year who'd gotten his MD from a Caribbean medical school and whose hand shook when he was nervous. He was nervous now. He stared at the monitor, at Riordan's rigid chest, at the oxygen saturation that was now 71 and falling like a stone dropped into dark water. What happened? Webb's voice cracked slightly. He was reaching for his phone to call someone, anyone higher in the chain of command who could tell him what to do. Tension pneumothorax, Megan said. She was already moving, her body acting before her mind caught up, or maybe her mind was the slowest part. Muscle memory was faster, muscle memory was always faster. Air in the pleural space. His lung collapsed. We need a needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Webb's hands fumbled with his phone. I should call. Megan was at the crash cart. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand, the alcohol prep in the other, one motion flowing into the next like she'd done this yesterday instead of 6 years ago, in a sandstorm in Anbar province with incoming mortars shaking the field hospital walls, with a young corporal who'd bled out before they could get him stabilized. She wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking about ribs. She was thinking about the anatomical landmarks under her left hand as she pressed it against Riordan's chest, feeling for the second rib, the intercostal space below it, the place where compressed air was crushing his lungs. You can't just, Webb started. Her hands moved on their own. The needle went in. Angled slightly upward. Muscle memory was a weapon. Muscle memory was what happened when you'd done something so many times it lived in your neurons like scar tissue. The hiss. That was the sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a lung re-inflating, the sound of someone getting a second chance. The hiss was biology and physics and the exact moment between death and survival. Riordan's chest expanded. The rigid muscles across his shoulders relaxed. His lips, still blue but less so, tried to form something, gratitude, maybe, or just the beginning of a breath that didn't hurt. O2 sat climbing, she said, watching the monitor. 71. 76. 82. Color improving. Get me a chest tube set up and call the attending. Stat. Webb was staring at her like she'd just materialized from another dimension. How did you know? Standard emergency protocol for tension pneumothorax. Megan was already documenting, her handwriting controlled and careful, every letter precise. Controlled. That was the word. That was the only word that mattered. You can observe the procedure for your own reference. She documented everything exactly as it should be documented. The time. The vital signs before and after. The procedure. The patient response. All of it by the book. All of it defensible. All of it visible to anyone who looked at the chart. She didn't notice her own hand shaking until the documentation was complete. The resident left to make calls. Megan stayed with Riordan, monitoring his oxygen saturation, his color, his pupils, the 1,000 small signs that said he was going to live. She checked the needle placement. She documented the vitals every 5 minutes. She moved through the next 20 minutes like a nurse who'd just performed a textbook emergency response. She didn't think about the sandstorm. She didn't think about the medic who'd died because she wasn't there, because they'd rotated her out. She didn't think about the reason Dr. Pierce had been watching her too closely, the reason he needed her gone, the reason a nurse who could see pharmaceutical discrepancies and perform emergency procedures was a problem instead of an asset. Dr. Pierce arrived at 3:07 a.m. 20 minutes after Riordan's lung had re-inflated. 20 minutes after the crisis had passed. He was wearing press slacks despite the hour. His hair was perfect. He looked like he'd gotten a call and dressed carefully before coming in, which was the kind of detail that mattered more than people realized. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicked. He was prepared. Dr. Webb informed me about our little excitement, Pierce said, his voice smooth as medication dripping from an for. He reviewed the chart, Megan's chart, her documentation, her precise and perfect charting, and his expression was calm. Calculated. The kind of calm that meant he was working something out. Excellent work, Dr. Webb, Pierce said, though Webb was standing right there looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Quick thinking. The attending will be impressed. Webb opened his mouth. Closed it. He knew, somehow, that he hadn't done anything except stand there. But he also knew that contradicting Dr. Pierce in front of Megan wasn't going to help anyone. Pierce turned to Riordan's chart and made 3 notes. Megan watched from the medication cart, careful not to move too quickly, careful not to show interest. She was very good at showing nothing at all. "I'm going to recommend that Corporal Riordan be transferred to the trauma floor," Pierce said. "For specialized monitoring. That level of acute decompensation requires more experienced staff." He said this while looking directly at her. "We want to ensure he receives the best possible care." The best possible care. Meaning, away from her. Meaning, somewhere she couldn't help him. Meaning, removed from the ICU where the emergency had happened and the emergency had been resolved and the evidence of her capability was now written into the permanent medical record in her own handwriting. "Of course, Doctor," Megan said. Her voice was soft. Deferential. The kind of voice that said she understood her place. "Whatever is best for the patient." Pierce smiled. Just slightly. Like a predator that had smelled blood in the water and was preparing to swim toward it. By 4:15 a.m., Riordan was already packed. By 4:44 a.m., he was gone, wheeled away by transport staff, his eyes finding Megan's for just one moment as he passed. Gratitude, confusion, the kind of look that said he knew something was wrong but didn't know what. She didn't let her expression change. She was someone who had learned that compassion was a liability. She tried to log into the ICU database at 5:36 a.m. to document the post-procedure vitals one final time. Authorization denied. The message appeared on the screen in red letters. Her credentials, which had been active for 14 months at Seattle General, had been restricted. She could no longer access ICU records. She could no longer view patient charts from the intensive care ward. She had been erased from the system that efficiently, that completely. She stared at the screen for exactly 3 seconds. Then she closed the terminal. From the hallway outside the administrator's office, she could see Pierce through the glass. He was on his phone. Then on another call. Then another call, his voice too low to hear but his body language saying everything, the confident posture, the slight smile, the gestures of someone making deals, calling in favors, arranging things. She recognized the names he was addressing, the hospital administrator on the first call, someone Pierce called board member on the second, and on the third call, someone he was clearly more concerned about pleasing. His tone changed, became more deferential, more careful. A person with actual power. A person who had something Pierce needed. The pharmaceutical kickback scheme. It had to be. Dr. Pierce wasn't the architect of this. He was a middle manager in a system that extended far higher than the ICU, far deeper than the hospital, far beyond anything she could report to a hospital ethics committee without triggering the one thing that would destroy everything, the Defense Intelligence Agency attention that would come if Captain Megan O'Brien suddenly existed again. She logged out of the system and stood up. Her shift was ending in 43 minutes. She had 43 minutes to act like nothing had changed. She had 43 minutes to move through the hospital like she was just a nurse, just someone who had performed a competent emergency response and nothing more, nothing that mattered, nothing that threatened anyone. She had 43 minutes before her life became a waiting game. When her shift ended at 6:33 a.m., the rain outside Seattle General was hammering the parking lot like applause for something she couldn't celebrate. The kind of rain that made the world look gray, that muffled sound, that made visibility so poor that people could drive right past you without seeing. She stood in the break room and pulled off her scrubs, folded them with hospital corners precision, and didn't think about the folded flag in her locker that she hadn't opened in 6 years. That wasn't going to help her now. That wasn't going to explain anything. That was just a piece of someone else's story. She hung her ID badge on the hook and walked toward the parking lot, toward the old truck she'd bought for cash under an assumed name, toward the motel room she was renting month to month. She was good at disappearing. She'd had a lot of practice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Riordan had needed her, and now he was on another floor, with other nurses, with Dr. Pierce watching him like he might testify to something important. The worst part was that she'd made herself visible, and visibility was the one thing that could get her killed, that could get the DIA involved, that could unravel every thread of safety she'd woven over 6 years of silence. The worst part was that for 45 seconds, she'd been Captain Megan O'Brien, and everyone in that ICU had seen her. The administrator's office smelled like old leather and the kind of expensive air freshener that couldn't quite mask the institutional fear underneath. 8:15 a.m. Megan sat in a chair that faced both the administrator's desk and the side door where Dr. Pierce emerged with a manila folder held like a weapon. He didn't sit. He stood at the periphery, a presence that made the temperature in the room drop 3 degrees. The administrator, a woman named Harriet Chen whose nameplate read a Vice President of Medical Affairs, opened the folder with the precision of someone performing an autopsy. Captain O'Brien, we've completed our internal review of the incident in ICU Bay 12. There are several concerns we need to address. Megan sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was flat. Empty. The voice of someone who had already calculated every angle and found no exit. I'm listening. Dr. Pierce stepped forward. The needle decompression procedure performed on Corporal Riordan at 2:11 a.m. was performed without attending physician authorization. While the outcome was successful, he paused, letting those words sit like a bitter taste. The protocol requires oversight. We have standards for a reason. The resident was frozen, Megan said. Patient was hypoxic. Lung collapsed. He would have been dead in 4 minutes. That's not the point, Pierce said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent the night rehearsing this. The point is that you exceeded your scope of practice. A nurse does not perform surgical procedures. A nurse does not make independent medical decisions of that magnitude. You weren't the attending physician. The procedure was unauthorized. Harriet Chen slid a document across the desk. 3 pages. Red ink highlighting specific passages. We've documented protocol violations, inappropriate patient boundary conditions, and what several staff members have characterized as overly familiar interactions with the patient. Dr. Pierce has expressed concern that your clinical judgment may be compromised. Megan read the fabrication with the calm of someone reading about a stranger. Patient boundary concerns, she repeated. The words tasted like ash. She could defend herself right now. Could explain that Riordan had no family in country, that he'd tried to code switch with her when he realized she understood military protocols, that his silent fingers had gripped her wrist the only way he could ask for human contact. She could tell them the truth about the morphine orders, about the supply contract anomaly she'd flagged that Dr. Pierce had systematically buried. She could blow the entire scheme open with 4 sentences. But Captain Megan O'Brien learned in Ramadi that some battles cannot be won with truth. The Defense Intelligence Agency had made that abundantly clear. Captain Megan O'Brien was legally dead. Her records were classified. Her existence was a national security liability if she ever surfaced. So the truth stayed buried, just like everything else. I understand, she said. Dr. Pierce's eyes narrowed. He'd been waiting for resistance, for anger, for the moment when she would stop being compliant and start fighting back. Her compliance disarmed him, left him searching for something to push against. This is not a decision we made lightly. But given the circumstances, given your pattern of boundary violations, we're recommending immediate termination with severance through the end of the month. Megan kept her hands folded. When? Effective immediately, Harriet Chen said. She slid a second folder across. Termination paperwork. 6 pages. Signature lines already highlighted. Your final check will be processed by Friday. Your employee badge will need to be returned. Clearance to the ICU floor has already been revoked from the system. 3 phone calls, Megan said quietly. Is that how this was coordinated? The silence that followed was like the moment before a helicopter blade stops spinning, the weight of it pressing down. Dr. Pierce's face tightened. I don't know what you're referring to. But she did. And they both knew it. He'd called Marcus Thibodeau, the board member who controlled 60% of the hospital's pharmaceutical contracts. He'd called Jennifer Webb, the administrator who had approved Pierce's supply vendor agreements without competitive bidding for the last 4 years. He'd called Robert Chen, Harriet's husband and a hospital trustee, with carefully calibrated language about regulatory vulnerabilities and staff liabilities. 3 phone calls. 3 people with financial incentive to make the inconvenient nurse disappear before she could become a problem. "We should have this wrapped up within the hour," Harriet said. "HR will need to conduct an exit interview. Then you're free to collect your belongings from your locker." Megan stood. She picked up the termination paperwork and signed it without reading the rest. Her signature came out steady, military precise. Captain Megan O'Brien signing away yet another identity. The third one in her life. The first in Army paperwork, the second in her grave in Arlington Cemetery, the third in a hospital administrator's filing system in Denver, Colorado. Pierce walked her out of the office. Not escorting, that would have been too obvious. But moving beside her, a constant pressure that felt like an undertow. In the hallway, he said quietly, "For what it's worth, I know you were trying to help. But this hospital has standards. Sometimes the best intentions create the worst problems." Megan didn't respond. She turned toward the employee lockers without acknowledging him. Let him have his justification. Let him believe his own narrative. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was gone, and he'd won, and the system had protected itself like it always did. The basement of Seattle General was the hospital's forgotten floor. Industrial washers the size of small cars churned constantly, filling the space with steam and the sharp chemical smell of bleach that burned the sinuses. This was where the contaminated linens came, where the hospital's invisible labor force processed the refuse of medicine, bloody gauze, vomitus-soaked sheets, the accumulated biological evidence of human suffering broken down and sterilized and recycled. Megan had come here exactly twice in 6 years. Once to find a blanket for a patient who was cold. Once when she needed to be alone. She had nothing in her locker except the things she'd brought on her first shift, a change of clothes, a protein bar she'd never eaten, and the folded flag. Small items. A military duffel bag would have been too conspicuous, too prepared. This life was always meant to be temporary, always meant to look like it could be abandoned at any moment. She stood at one of the industrial folding stations, the kind with a smooth metal surface designed for processing hospital linens in bulk. 3 of her 6 scrubs lay in front of her. She'd worn all of them exactly 13 times. The 4th was still in the return bin, soaked in Riordan's blood and the residual adrenaline of saving someone who couldn't ask to be saved. Her hands moved through the familiar geometry of hospital corners. Fold. Crease. Fold. Crease. Each movement was deliberate, mechanical, the kind of precision that came from training that had become muscle memory. Basic training had taught her how to fold a uniform with the corners so sharp they could cut paper. 6 years of hospital work had taught her how to do the same thing with scrubs. The 2 languages of her life were folding perfectly into each other. The laundry supervisor, a woman named Dorothy who'd worked in the basement for 31 years, had been watching from across the room. She moved slowly, her knees audible with each step, worn cartilage, the sound of aging in a basement without windows. She stood beside Megan and didn't say anything for almost a minute. Just watched her fold the scrubs with that impossible precision. "You were the best nurse on that floor," Dorothy finally said. "Everyone knew it. The patients asked for you by name. The residents tried to learn from you. I've been here 31 years and I've seen nurses come and go, and I've never seen anyone work like you work. You treated that job like it meant something." Megan's throat tightened. Not her eyes. Never her eyes. But the back of her throat suddenly felt like someone had wrapped wire around it. She completed the final crease on the last scrub, folded it into a perfect square, and placed all 3 into the hospital return bin. Clean scrubs in. Contaminated scrubs out. The cycle continuing without her. "Thank you," Megan said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, from another country, from another life. That means something. She placed the folded flag, the only item that belonged to her personally, the only item she could take into her jacket pocket. It made a small rectangular shape against her ribs, the way it had for 6 years. The flag from Thomas Garrett's funeral. The one that had been folded by an honor guard while she stood at attention in uniform in Arlington Cemetery, her own face obscured by aviator glasses and the careful construction of grief that didn't exist anymore because grief required connection and she had severed every connection she'd ever had. The exit path took her past the employee entrance, but she couldn't leave that way. Too visible. Too final. Too much like walking out of a life that had already been erased. Instead, she moved toward the ER intake corridor, the back way, the path nurses took when they needed to move through the hospital without being noticed. That's when she heard it. The commotion. Not the normal rhythm of emergency medicine, but something else. Controlled chaos. Multiple voices overlapping. A trauma alert call-out that registered in her muscles before her mind could process what it meant. An ER resident was shouting about surgical prep. A paramedic was calling out vitals. Perforated bowel, possible internal hemorrhage, ETA to OR is 6 minutes. And then she heard it. A voice cutting through the medical chaos. Accented. Sedated but conscious. Speaking to the trauma nurses in what sounded like Arabic and English mixed together. A gurney was being pushed through the ER entrance corridor, the patient conscious despite sedation, his eyes moving across the assembled trauma team. And those eyes, dark, intense, focused with the kind of attention that came from someone trained to process threat, locked directly onto Megan standing in the hallway. The Iraqi man's lips moved. His sedation was fighting with adrenaline and whatever revelation had just happened in the back of an ambulance. He reached one hand off the stretcher as he passed, not far enough to be stopped by the trauma nurses, and he whispered one word with absolute clarity. Valkyrie. Megan's body went entirely still. That word. That name. That call sign that belonged to someone who had died in the basement of Seattle General exactly 2 hours ago. Valkyrie. One word. Whispered in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2. The Iraqi translator, dark eyes, surgical bandages across his ribs, locked onto Megan's face as she passed with her final paycheck folded in her scrub pocket, and he said it like a prayer. Like recognition. Like proof that ghosts don't actually disappear, they just learn to move through walls. She stopped. Her hand steadied against the doorframe, muscles locking in a way civilians couldn't detect. The translator smiled, exhausted, post-operative, but genuinely seeing her for the first time. My brother's unit. You led the extraction from Jolin District. We thought you died there. They all did. Megan's jaw tightened once, barely perceptible. 7 years. 7 years of being legally dead, of erased records and buried call signs, and it took one word from a man who shouldn't have known to crack the foundation she'd built on silence. She didn't respond. Couldn't. The Dia's warning had been explicit, your existence remains classified. Acknowledge nothing. Defend nothing. Disappear. She was turning back toward the exit when the voice carried down the main corridor like a bell struck in an empty church. Captain Megan O'Brien, United States Army Special Forces Command. Led Joint Task Force 18 on March 14, 2017, in Ramadi's northeast sector. Retrieved 17 American personnel and 4 Allied soldiers from a collapsed safe house while under sustained small arms fire and IED detonation. Medical interventions performed under fire included emergency cricothyrotomy, field amputation, and massive transfusion protocol. The Marine Corps liaison, a woman in dress blues with captain's bars and a voice that carried the weight of official record, stood near the main desk, reading from a manila folder, her words cutting through the hospital fluorescence like artillery fire echoing through corridors that suddenly understood they were standing on contested ground. Citation for Vela pending review. Decoration suppressed by executive order pending declassification protocol. The hospital staff froze. Actual physiological freeze, the kind that happens when the ordinary world collides with something vast and unmeasurable. The residents who'd laughed during grand rounds 2 days ago found sudden urgent interest in their phones. The nursing supervisor's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Dr. Pierce burst from his office like something was burning. This is absolutely unacceptable. This is a dangerous confusion. His voice cut high and sharp, voice of a man who'd spent a decade controlling the narrative and wasn't about to surrender it in front of witnesses. This woman was terminated for protocol violations. I have documentation, extensive documentation, of unauthorized procedures and insubordination. Whatever this citation pertains to is irrelevant to her civilian employment record. We cannot allow classified material to confuse hospital administration about legitimate personnel decisions. He was moving toward the Marine liaison now, positioning himself between the folder and everyone else, hands out like he could physically push the past back into whatever sealed file it had escaped from. The elevator chimed. A two-star general stepped out in dress uniform, medals arranged across his chest in ascending order of prestige, boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the fluorescent lights like he was walking through a cleared field. He didn't look left or right. He walked directly to Megan O'Brien, placed his feet at attention, and raised his hand. A salute. Full formal salute. The gesture landed like a physical force. Not a greeting. Not a courtesy. A recognition. An acknowledgement that every second she'd spent invisible, every moment of composure masking what lived underneath her civilian scrubs, had been witnessed and recorded and counted for something that mattered. Captain O'Brien, the general said, his voice steady as ballast. Your service record has been restored. Codename Valkyrie is fully declassified as of 6 months ago. We've been attempting to locate you through official channels. His eyes moved down her torso, lingering on the scrubs, then her hands. I understand you performed emergency decompression on one of our soldiers 72 hours ago. That soldier is alive because you were here. Dr. Pierce stepped forward. Sir, I don't know what you've been briefed on, but this is a civilian facility and Ms. O'Brien was not acting under military authority. In fact, she violated multiple protocols. You're done. The general's voice didn't raise. Didn't need to. Federal agents are currently reviewing your pharmaceutical procurement records. $3 million in inflated morphine orders. Falsified supplier documentation. And when Captain O'Brien here became a liability to your system, you fabricated her personnel file to justify termination. The general paused. That falsification gave the FBI their final piece of evidence. The FBI agents came off the stairwell like they'd been waiting for the cue. 2 of them, credentials already out, moving with the casual precision of people who'd done this before. The older one, graying temples, eyes that had seen too many offices too many times, spoke to Pierce's chest, not his face. Dr. Stephen Pierce. You're under arrest for federal fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and falsification of personnel records in a federal investigation. The handcuffs were smooth titanium, and they caught the light as they came off his belt. You have the right to remain silent. Pierce's face cycled through a map of emotions, confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear disguised as indignation. I want my lawyer. I have nothing to say. This is harassment. This is a setup. He was backing toward the wall now, his hands already moving to the edge of the corridor, trying to create distance, trying to reassert control. The handcuffs went on with professional efficiency. His expensive watch, some brand that required 6 figures to wear, caught the light as the metal closed around his wrist. The hospital staff parted. Actually parted, the way water moves around a sinking object. The 2 residents who'd laughed during grand rounds wouldn't make eye contact. The nursing supervisor was suddenly very interested in a computer screen. The hospital administrator appeared from nowhere, approaching Megan with the expression of someone who'd just understood that the ground beneath his feet was unstable and had been unstable for weeks without him noticing. Captain O'Brien, on behalf of Seattle General, I want to extend my sincere apologies. We should have investigated Dr. Pierce's claims more thoroughly. We should have asked questions. I'm authorized to offer you immediate reinstatement with full back pay, retroactive to your termination date, and a formal letter of exoneration in your personnel file. Megan watched Pierce being escorted toward the exit, the same corridor she'd walked 2 hours ago, carrying her separation papers and the weight of 7 years of invisible service. Her face remained composed. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding yourself rigid for so long that the muscles forget how to relax. The Marine liaison approached, the folder still in her hands. "Captain, the Corps has been looking for you. We have a consulting position. Training new combat medics. Full recognition of your service. Full benefits package." Megan's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a rasp she hadn't noticed before. "I was told to disappear. After Ramadi, the DIA said my records were a liability. They said if anyone knew what I'd done, if anyone connected the operation to my name, it would compromise ongoing investigations. They said I had to vanish into civilian life and never acknowledge. That operation was declassified 6 months ago," the Pentagon official interrupted. His uniform was even more decorated than the general's, which seemed statistically improbable. "Your records have been restored. You've been legally alive again for half a year, Captain. No one thought to tell you because no one knew where you disappeared to. You did your job too well." The weight of it settled across her shoulders like body armor, the kind that's meant to protect you but instead just reminds you that you're always carrying something. 6 years of hiding. 6 years of building a civilian identity on the bones of a ghost. 6 years of touching a folded flag in a scrub pocket like it was the only piece of the past she was allowed to acknowledge. And now, in the space of 5 minutes, she was legal again. Visible. Real. "I need to check on my patient," Megan said. "Corporal Roy Arden. The one in trauma." The general nodded like he'd expected this exact response. "He's been asking about you. We've been authorized to tell him everything." She found him in the recovery room on the 3rd floor, the same mute veteran she'd saved 72 hours ago, the one who'd taken her place on the team, who'd lost his voice to shrapnel doing the exact job she'd trained him to do. He was sitting up now, the breathing tube gone, his chest wrapped in fresh gauze. His eyes tracked her as she entered, and something in them shifted. Recognition. Understanding. When he spoke, his voice came out as a rasp, barely functional, the vocal cords scarred beyond full repair. "You're not just a nurse." It wasn't a question. "No," Megan said. "I'm not. The general told me. Told me about Ramadi. Told me you let us in because I was trapped." His hand moved to his chest, touching the bandages covering the wound she'd dressed the night of his collapse. "You didn't have to come back to civilian life. You didn't have to be here when I needed help. But you were." Megan pulled a chair to the side of his bed and sat with the kind of stillness that comes from combat medicine, the kind where you learn that sometimes presence is all anyone needs. Outside the window, Denver sprawled beneath an afternoon sky, the hospital humming its mechanical rhythm around them, fluorescent lights buzzing like distant machinery in some vast operation most people would never understand. A knock on the doorframe. The Iraqi translator, moving carefully, one hand pressed to his incision. He handed Megan a photograph, edges worn, colors faded from 6 years in an archive somewhere. Her team. Standing in desert dust in front of a compound wall, weapons slung across their chests, the teammate whose flag she carried visible in the back row, squinting at the camera like the sun was both enemy and friend. "My brother's unit sent this," the translator said. "They wanted you to know. Valkyrie lived." Megan took the photograph with steady hands. For the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to remember without hiding. Without compartmentalizing. Without placing the memory in a locked space that only opened in supply closets at 3 a.m. She was a nurse. A captain. A ghost who'd learned to live among the living. A soldier who'd set down her weapons and picked up a stethoscope and never understood until this moment that she'd been doing the same work all along, saving lives, holding the line, bearing witness to the people who came through the doors carrying their own invisible wars. The hospital corridor stretched ahead, fluorescent and familiar, and she walked it in scrubs that carried both identities now, the captain she was, and the nurse she became. Thank you for watching. If you're moved by stories of courage and sacrifice, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories of hidden heroes, and comment below, what would you have done in Megan's position? Should she take the consulting role with the Marines, or continue her work as a nurse? Let's talk about it.